bright lights of Las Vegas illuminated the octagon on January 20, 2024, as one of the most anticipated matchups in the UFC took place. The air was thick with excitement, the roar of the crowd vibrating through every fiber of the arena, as Khamzat Chimaev, the undefeated, ferocious force from Sweden, stepped into the cage to face the tough and gritty Marvin Vettori. Both men had a lot to prove, and this fight was more than just a contest of skill. It was a battle for supremacy, a fight for the future of the UFC's middleweight division. Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content. Chimaev's rise through the ranks had been nothing short of meteoric. From the moment he made his UFC debut, he captured the attention of fans and fighters alike with his brutal efficiency. A wrecking ball who seemed unstoppable, Chimaev had promised to dominate the middleweight division, and each fight seemed to confirm his potential. But on the other side of the octagon stood Marvin Vettori, a fighter who had faced some of the best in the world and who had made it clear that he would not go down without a fight. Vettori was tough as nails, a seasoned veteran who had the kind of experience that could test Chimaev's skills in ways he hadn't been tested before. The stakes were high. For Chimaev, a victory here wasn't just about maintaining his undefeated record. It was about taking one more step towards securing a title shot. For Vettori, this was an opportunity to prove that he belonged at the top of the division. Both men had been calling for this fight for a while, and now the time had come. The atmosphere was electric, the tension palpable. As they stood across from each other, there was an unspoken understanding between the two fighters. This was going to be a war. The fight began with both men feeling each other out, but it didn't take long for Chimaev to impose his will. With his aggressive pace and relentless pressure, he immediately showed Vettori that he wasn't going to back down. Chimaev's striking was precise, his footwork fast, and his ability to dictate the tempo was unmatched. But Vettori wasn't just going to give up. The Italian fighter responded with grit, landing some solid shots of his own, pushing Chimaev to dig deep and prove that he truly was the next big thing in the sport. Round after round, the tension built. Chimaev's dominance was clear, but Vettori's toughness kept him in the fight. Crowd was on edge, knowing that at any moment the tide could turn. But despite Vettori's heart, it was Chimaev who continued to control the action. His relentless pace, his ability to avoid damage, and his suffocating style of fighting were starting to take their toll. The question on everyone's mind was, could Vettori withstand the pressure for the full 5 rounds? Would he be able to turn the tide and give Chimaev his first real test? Or would Chimaev prove, once again, that he was simply too much to handle? As the final round approached, the energy in the arena reached a fever pitch. Fans were on their feet, and the fighters were digging deep, leaving it all on the line. In the end, it was clear that Chimaev's superior skill and unyielding pressure had been too much for Vettori. When the judges' scorecards were read, it was announced Khamzat Chimaev had won by unanimous decision. Another victory, another statement made. But while Chimaev had come out on top, the fight had been closer than many had expected. Vettori had shown that he could hang with the best, and the middleweight division was more exciting than ever. As Chimaev raised his hand in victory, the crowd roared in approval. But this was far from the end of his journey. With his victory, Chimaev had solidified his position as a top contender, but the road ahead was only going to get tougher. The question now wasn't just whether he could continue his dominance, but who would be next to challenge him. Would it be the champion, Israel Adesanya, or someone else looking to take Chimaev's spot? Only time would tell, but one thing was for certain. The UFC had a new force to be reckoned with, and his name was Khamzat Chimaev. But as Chimaev left the octagon that night, the whispers began. Some people were already questioning whether he was truly ready for a title shot. They wanted to see him against the very best, to see if his dominance would hold up under the highest level of competition. Chimaev's journey wasn't over. The middleweight division was full of hungry fighters, and Chimaev's place at the top was still in question. What does the future hold for Khamzat Chimaev? Can he continue to conquer the middleweight division and secure his place as the best in the world? And what about Marvin Vettori? After this loss, can he bounce back and reassert himself as a top contender? Or will he be left behind in a division that continues to evolve? The answers to these questions are still unknown, and the story of Khamzat Chimaev and Marvin Vettori is far from over. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Khamzat Chimaev had already established himself as one of the most intriguing fighters to step into the UFC. His journey to this point had been filled with incredible moments that seemed almost too good to be true for anyone but him. From the moment he burst onto the scene with that unforgettable debut, a performance that saw him take just 10 days to dominate 2 opponents in different weight classes, Chimaev had earned the reputation of a fighter unlike any other. A destroyer in the cage, he had quickly built a loyal following of fans who saw in him the future of mixed martial arts. Chimaev's rise wasn't just a result of his brutal fighting style. It was his unyielding mentality, his hunger to be the best, that really set him apart. The intensity with which he approached each fight was palpable, and the way he seemingly bulldozed through his opponents raised questions in the minds of the fans and analysts alike. Was Chimaev really that good? Or was he simply catching his opponents off guard with his relentless pressure? Some people believed that he was the real deal, while others wondered if his meteoric rise had come a little too fast. It was this uncertainty that made his fight with Marvin Vettori so fascinating. Vettori, on the other hand, had already been through the ringer. He wasn't an undefeated phenom like Chimaev. Rather, he was a battle-tested veteran who had been in the cage with the best in the world. Vettori's biggest claim to fame was his ability to take punches and keep coming forward, a skill that had allowed him to weather storms against fighters like Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker. While he hadn't managed to claim the title, he had come close on several occasions, and his toughness made him one of the most respected middleweights in the sport. Their fight at UFC 311 was, in many ways, a clash of 2 very different types of fighters. Chimaev represented the new wave of MMA, young, hungry, and seemingly unstoppable. Vettori, on the other hand, was the embodiment of the old guard. His resilience, his experience, and his unrelenting will to win were qualities that had kept him at the top of the division for years. Chimaev had never faced a fighter like Vettori before, and Vettori had never faced a fighter with the kind of raw aggression and intensity that Chimaev brought to the octagon. As the fight unfolded, it became clear that both men were testing each other in ways they hadn't been tested before. For Chimaev, this was more than just another victory. It was a chance to prove that his dominance could stand up to a fighter with the heart and experience of Vettori. For Vettori, this was an opportunity to show that the new generation had yet to fully take over, that he still had the ability to stand toe-to-toe with the very best. The first round began with both fighters taking a cautious approach. Chimaev, known for his aggressive forward pressure, came out strong, but Vettori wasn't about to be intimidated. He fired back with jabs, working his way inside to land some solid body shots. Chimaev's defensive skills were on display, as he evaded most of the punches, but there were moments where Vettori's strikes seemed to rattle him just slightly. It wasn't much, but in a fight of this caliber, every exchange mattered. As the second round began, Chimaev's confidence seemed to grow. He started to find his rhythm, landing clean strikes and controlling the center of the octagon. Vettori, ever the gritty competitor, didn't back down, but he couldn't seem to match the pace Chimaev was setting. The Swedish fighter was everywhere, pressuring Vettori against the cage, landing shots to the head and body, and not giving his opponent a moment to breathe. The crowd could sense that something was brewing. Would Vettori be able to weather the storm, or was this the beginning of the end? The third round saw Vettori begin to rally. It was clear that he wasn't going to go down without a fight. The Italian fighter, known for his resilience, dug deep and landed some hard punches that seemed to stagger Chimaev. It was a glimpse of the kind of fighter Vettori had been throughout his career, tough, relentless, and capable of pulling out something special when the odds were against him. But even as he found some success, Chimaev was unrelenting. It was a constant back and forth, with neither man willing to give an inch. As the fight moved into the championship rounds, the tension in the arena was palpable. The crowd knew they were witnessing something special. Chimaev, despite his aggression and power, had never faced a fighter like Vettori, a man who could absorb punishment and keep coming. The question was hanging in the air. Could Chimaev break Vettori's will? Or would the Italian fighter's experience and toughness prove to be the deciding factor? The fourth round was perhaps the most telling of the entire fight. Chimaev's intensity remained unyielding, but Vettori's heart shone through as he fought back with everything he had. The back-and-forth exchanges were explosive, with both fighters trading shots in a way that had the crowd on their feet. Chimaev's striking was as fast and precise as ever, but Vettori was starting to find a rhythm, landing shots to Chimaev's head and body that had the potential to change the course of the fight. For a moment, it seemed as though Chimaev might be rattled, but his composure under pressure was evident. He wasn't going to let Vettori's heart get the better of him. The final round arrived, and by this point, it was clear that Chimaev was still in control. The early rounds had taken their toll on Vettori, and despite his efforts, it seemed like he couldn't catch a break. Chimaev had managed to impose his will for the majority of the fight, using his aggression, technique, and conditioning to wear down his opponent. But Vettori was still fighting back, still pushing forward, and still proving why he was one of the most respected fighters in the middleweight division. When the final bell rang, there was no doubt that Chimaev had done enough to secure the victory. But as the judges tallied their scorecards, the question remained, how dominant had Chimaev truly been? Had he answered all of the critics who had questioned whether he was ready for the elite competition in the UFC? Or had Vettori shown enough to prove that the young fighter still had a lot to learn? The decision was read. Khamzat Chimaev had won by unanimous decision. Crowd erupted in cheers as Chimaev raised his hand in victory, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this win wasn't as satisfying as he had hoped. For a fighter who had been dominating his opponents with ease, this victory was a reminder that there were challenges ahead, real challenges, where nothing would come easy. The middleweight division was filled with tough competitors, and Chimaev's place at the top was still being earned, one fight at a time. And then, as the crowd continued to cheer, Chimaev made a statement. "This is just the beginning," he said, his eyes blazing with intensity. It was clear that he wasn't satisfied with just being a contender. He wanted the title. He wanted to prove that he was the best in the world, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get there. But with champions like Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, and Jared Cannonier still in the picture, the road to the title wasn't going to be easy. Marvin Vettori, meanwhile, walked out of the cage with his head held high. Despite the loss, he had shown the world that he could still hang with the best. He had taken everything Chimaev had thrown at him, and while he hadn't come out on top, his performance had earned him respect. The middleweight division, as always, was full of opportunities, and Vettori knew that he wasn't done yet. He would be back, more determined than ever, to prove that he still had a future at the top. And so, with Chimaev's victory and Vettori's resilience, the middleweight division found itself at a crossroads. What would come next for both men? Would Chimaev continue his path to greatness, or would the competition prove to be more than he could handle? And for Vettori, the answers to these questions were still unknown. The mystery of what was to come hung in the air, and the tension was only just beginning to build. The tension surrounding Khamzat Chimaev's victory at UFC 311 was thick. The roar of the crowd had barely settled before the first whispers of doubt began to surface. Sure, Chimaev had won, but the fight against Marvin Vettori had been closer than many had anticipated. For someone who had obliterated opponents with seeming ease in the past, Chimaev's performance on that night left room for questions. Had he truly lived up to the hype? Or had the new blood of the UFC been exposed, showing that even the most dominant forces could be tested when they went up against a seasoned veteran like Vettori? On the surface, it was another dominant win for Chimaev. But the underlying conflict was far from resolved. As he made his way backstage, sweat still dripping from his brow, the weight of the victory seemed to sit heavy on his shoulders. The long journey to the top wasn't as simple as he had once thought. Each step, each fight, each opponent was a new challenge, a new piece of the puzzle. And Chimaev, despite his confidence, knew that the puzzle wasn't complete yet. It was far from it. As the days passed following UFC 311, the victory over Vettori had been significant, but the critics weren't letting up. Headlines were already questioning Chimaev's ability to take on the champions of the division, and while some of the whispers were from fans eager to see the next big thing fall, others came from within the sport itself. Coaches, analysts, and former fighters began discussing whether Chimaev could truly handle the relentless pressure of a title fight against someone like Israel Adesanya, or if he was still too raw and refined. At the same time, the spotlight on Vettori was just as intense. The Italian fighter, ever resilient, had walked out of the octagon that night with his head held high, but deep down he knew that a loss of this nature would mark a shift in his career. For years, he had been a top contender, battling his way up the ranks with grit and determination. Yet, with each passing year, the competition seemed to be getting younger, faster, and more aggressive. Chimaev's performance had been a reminder that age and experience alone weren't enough to keep a fighter at the top. As much as Vettori believed in his heart that he still had what it took, the division was evolving faster than he could keep up. But Vettori was not one to stay down for long. His mind raced as he replayed the fight over and over. What could he have done differently? Where did he fall short? His pride stung, but so did the reality that he had been outpaced by a younger fighter. The middleweight division had always been full of tough fighters, but it was beginning to feel like there was a generational shift underway, one that Vettori might not be able to stop. Yet, in his heart, he knew there was more to him than the loss. He couldn't go out like this. He couldn't let Chimaev's win define the end of his journey. But how? The road to redemption was murky, and Vettori would have to figure out a way to re-establish himself in a division that was rapidly passing him by. Meanwhile, Chimaev's internal conflict was equally intense. Despite the media attention and praise for his victory, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't done enough to prove his place at the top. Deep down, He knew that Vettori, despite his toughness, wasn't the level of competition that would truly test his skill and his will. Chimaev's ambitions had always been to take down the champions, to stand at the top of the sport. He wasn't interested in simply being another contender. He wanted to be the man, the fighter who had transcended the competition. The kind of fighter who would leave a legacy so profound that no one could question his place in history. But that would require more than just wins. It would require true mastery, true control, true dominance against the best. His victory against Vettori was a step in the right direction, but it was still a long way from proving he could dethrone the king, Israel Adesanya. And with fighters like Robert Whittaker and Jared Cannonier lurking in the shadows, the path to the title seemed more perilous than ever. Chimaev had to keep moving forward, but the weight of his own expectations was a constant presence, pushing him harder than ever. But it wasn't just his internal pressure that weighed on him. The voices from outside, those of the fans and analysts, were getting louder. Would Chimaev truly be able to withstand the pressure of a title fight? Could he keep up with the likes of Adesanya, who had been in the championship rounds countless times? Was Chimaev, despite his destructive power, truly ready to step into the cage with the best of the best? It was a question that haunted him as much as it did the critics. As the weeks went on, both Chimaev and Vettori knew that they were at a crossroads. For Chimaev, the call for a title shot would inevitably grow louder, but the question remained, was he truly ready? And for Vettori, the path forward was unclear. He had the skill and the heart, but was it enough to break back into the top ranks? The division was filled with hungry fighters, each one eyeing the top spot, and Vettori knew that every fight from here on out would be more critical than the last. Then came the news that sent ripples through the MMA world. The UFC had confirmed that Chimaev's next fight would be a title eliminator against one of the division's top names. The hype surrounding the fight was unlike anything the sport had seen before. Fans, analysts, and even the fighters themselves were buzzing with excitement. This would be the fight that could catapult Chimaev to a title shot, a chance to prove that he was more than just a contender, that he could be the king of the middleweight division. But the question was, who would he face? As the UFC began to put the fight together, the landscape of the middleweight division became more chaotic. Israel Adesanya, the reigning champion, was locked in his own battle, dealing with challengers like Robert Whittaker and the ever-dangerous Jared Cannonier. Chimaev's potential title shot seemed to hang in the balance, a sword of Damocles that could come crashing down at any moment. The clock was ticking, and Chimaev knew that time was running out. His opportunity for greatness was drawing closer, but with each passing day, the pressure to deliver was only growing heavier. For Vettori, the situation was just as critical. He had made it clear that he wasn't ready to give up his spot in the top ranks without a fight. He had already started his preparations for his next fight, determined to prove that he was far from finished. But what he didn't expect was the intensity of the competition. The middleweight division wasn't just a fight for the belt anymore. It was a fight for survival. New challengers were emerging, and every fighter had their eyes on the throne. Would Vettori be able to make the kind of comeback that would secure him another shot at the title? Or had the world already passed him by? Both fighters were trapped in a web of expectation, pressure, and uncertainty. For Chimaev, the road to the title was fraught with obstacles, both external and internal. For Vettori, the question was whether his time had passed or if he could summon the strength to fight back into contention. The middleweight division was as unpredictable as ever, and with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. But for now, the world was waiting. The next chapter was unfolding, And it was clear that the story of Khamzat Chimaev and Marvin Vettori was far from over. The mystery of who would rise to the top and who would be left behind was still hanging in the balance. The answers were elusive, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. As the weeks passed, the tension surrounding Khamzat Chimaev's next fight intensified. The UFC had made it clear that his road to the title was coming fast. His victory over Marvin Vettori at UFC 311 had brought him closer to the top than ever before. But the question remained, was he truly ready to face the elite? Fans were split. Some believed he was the future of the sport, a fighter capable of dethroning champions with ease. Others remained skeptical, convinced that the test of facing a reigning champion like Israel Adesanya would expose Chimaev's flaws. But for Chimaev, there was no turning back. The spotlight was on him now, brighter than it had ever been. He had the world's attention, but that attention came with a weight that he could feel bearing down on him every time he stepped into the gym. The pressure to perform was immense. He wasn't just fighting for another win. He was fighting to prove that he belonged at the top. And still, there were whispers. Whispers about his conditioning, his technique, his ability to go the distance with a fighter like Adesanya. Even his closest training partners, those who had seen his brilliance up close, were beginning to wonder if the mental game would be his biggest challenge. Chimaev had been an unstoppable force in the octagon, but the mental fortitude required to face a champion was something entirely different. Adesanya wasn't just skilled, he was a strategist, a fighter who could read his opponents and exploit their weaknesses like few others in the sport. Every training session became more intense, more focused. Chimaev was not leaving anything to chance. He worked on his striking, his grappling, his defense. Every aspect of his game was under scrutiny as he prepared for the fight of his life. But in the back of his mind, the questions lingered. Was he truly ready for the level of fight that was coming? And if he failed, if he fell short, would he ever get another chance? On the other side of the equation, Marvin Vettori was quietly plotting his return. He had taken the loss to Chimaev hard, but his resolve was unwavering. There were no easy paths back to the top, and Vettori knew that better than anyone. He had seen fighters come and go, but he was still here, still battling to prove that he was more than just a tough guy who could take a beating. The middleweight division was evolving, but Vettori was determined to show that he still had the skill, the heart, and the determination to fight for another shot at the title. His training camps had grown even more grueling in the months following his loss. He knew that his next fight could make or break his career. If he didn't win, the whispers would only grow louder, and the questions would become harder to ignore. Was Vettori still relevant? Could he still compete with the best in the world? These were questions that weighed heavily on him as he pushed through his preparations. The middleweight division wasn't waiting for anyone. The new generation of fighters was already knocking on the door, and if Vettori didn't act fast, he might be left behind. But despite the internal pressure, Vettori remained focused. He had been in the cage with the best, and he knew that his experience could be a weapon. His mindset was sharper than ever, and he was ready to prove that he was still one of the best in the world. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. As the date of Chimaev's title eliminator drew nearer, the tension in the MMA community reached a fever pitch. Fans were eager to see the young gun face off against the seasoned champion. But there was one thing that no one could predict. How would Chimaev react to the magnitude of the moment? The lights of the UFC's biggest stage had a way of exposing weaknesses in even the most skilled fighters. And for Chimaev, this fight would be different. It wasn't just about the title shot anymore. It was about proving to himself and to the world that he was more than just a fighter with a fast rise. He was a fighter who could handle the heat, handle the pressure, and come out on top. For Chimaev, the idea of facing Israel Adesanya loomed large. The Nigerian-born New Zealand champion was everything Chimaev had ever wanted to be. He was a complete fighter, a master of movement, distance, and timing. His striking was near perfect, and his ability to control the pace of a fight was unrivaled. But Chimaev wasn't afraid. He'd always been the one to chase greatness, to seek out challenges that others would shy away from. And now, the ultimate challenge was on the horizon. But as the fight drew closer, cracks began to appear in Chimaev's armor. The pressures, both mental and physical, were starting to take their toll. He had trained harder than ever, but there was something in the back of his mind telling him that he wasn't quite prepared for what was coming. Adesanya wasn't just another opponent. He was a champion who had been through the wars and emerged victorious every time. The thought of facing him was both exhilarating and terrifying. The fight against Adesanya was becoming more than just a fight. It was a test of everything Chimaev had worked for. Could he handle the pressure of fighting for the title, or would the moment overwhelm him? The stakes couldn't have been higher. Fans and analysts were watching with bated breath, wondering whether Chimaev's confidence would translate into success in the cage. In the final weeks leading up to the fight, Chimaev's nerves began to surface. Despite his outward confidence, he couldn't help but question himself. The pressure to perform, to live up to the hype, was suffocating. Every interview, every media appearance only amplified the noise. And while he had the support of his team, his trainers, and his fans, the weight of the occasion began to feel heavier than anything he had ever faced before. Could he really do it? Could he really dethrone Adesanya, the champion who had stood as the king of the division for so long? Meanwhile, Adesanya was quietly preparing for what many were calling the most dangerous challenge of his career. He had faced all kinds of opponents in the cage, but Chimaev was different. The young Swede's explosive power, relentless aggression, and unorthodox style made him an unpredictable threat. And Adesanya knew that he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He was the champion, and his legacy was on the line. Every day that passed seemed to make the tension greater. The fight was more than just a chance for Chimaev to prove himself. It was a chance for Adesanya to solidify his legacy as one of the greatest middleweights of all time. But as the days ticked down, both fighters knew that one small mistake could be the difference between victory and defeat. Time for preparation was over. It was time to fight. And so, as the final days before the fight arrived, both men were locked in their own worlds of preparation. For Chimaev, this was the moment he had worked his entire life for. For Adesanya, it was just another challenge to conquer. But the world was waiting to see who would rise and who would fall. The tension was unbearable, and no one knew what the outcome would be. The cage was waiting. The lights were on, and both men were ready for battle. The countdown had begun, and nothing would be the same after this fight. As the days ticked down, the fight between Khamzat Chimaev and Israel Adesanya was shaping up to be a spectacle unlike any the UFC had seen before. The anticipation was building, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold in the octagon. Fans, analysts, and even fellow fighters were all talking about the inevitable clash between the unstoppable force and the immovable object, the young, hungry challenger, versus the seasoned, crafty champion. But just when it seemed like the fight was destined to happen, a bombshell dropped, shaking the entire UFC community to its core. A report surfaced late one evening that left fans in disbelief. Israel Adesanya had suffered a training injury. The nature of the injury was initially unclear, but the rumors swirled quickly. Was it serious enough to pull him from the fight? Was this the perfect opportunity for Chimaev to take the throne? The news hit like a thunderclap. For days, speculation ran rampant. Some sources claimed that the injury was minor and that Adesanya would recover in time for the fight. Others suggested that it could be far worse enough to derail his title defense entirely. Chimaev's team had been quiet, watching from the sidelines as the drama played out, but inside, the uncertainty was gnawing at them. Would this delay or cancel their chance to finally face the champion? Could they even trust the validity of the rumors? And if Adesanya was truly hurt, how would it affect the narrative surrounding Chimaev's rise? Would it diminish his moment if he won the title under these circumstances? In the midst of this uncertainty, Chimaev found himself facing a new mental challenge. The fighter, who had always been relentless, hungry, and single-minded, was now forced to grapple with something he had never truly encountered: waiting. The road to the title had never been this complicated, and with each passing day, the tension continued to build. The waiting game became a battle of its own. Chimaev's team urged him to stay focused, to continue his training as though nothing had changed. But deep down, he knew that the situation had shifted. His shot at the title might not come as planned, and the fear of losing the momentum he had built was starting to creep in. Meanwhile, Adesanya remained largely silent in the media. The champion's usual confidence was replaced with a hint of mystery. Fans and analysts alike were left to speculate, but Adesanya wasn't giving much away. His calm demeanor during this time was almost unsettling. Was he preparing to step into the cage despite the injury, or was he genuinely considering pulling out of the fight altogether? The world watched, waiting for an official statement. But the questions continued to mount. If Adesanya pulled out, who would Chimaev face next? Would he still fight for the title, or would another contender step in? The UFC was known for making quick adjustments, but the looming uncertainty cast a shadow over everything. Would Chimaev's next opponent be someone he wasn't prepared for? Someone who could derail his plans entirely? This new twist had introduced a level of unpredictability that made the stakes even higher. In the meantime, Marvin Vettori, having caught wind of the situation, began to make his own moves. The middleweight division was in flux, and he knew that a new opportunity could present itself at any moment. While Chimaev was preparing for a shot at the title, Vettori was quietly positioning himself as a potential contender. If Adesanya truly wasn't going to fight, and the UFC needed a new title challenger, Vettori was ready to make his case. He hadn't lost his belief that he could beat Chimaev in a rematch, or that he could dethrone Adesanya if given the chance. It was a dangerous game, one that he knew could either make or break his career, but Vettori's resolve was unwavering. He was going to seize the moment. With Chimaev's focus divided between preparing for a fight that might never happen and the growing possibility of a replacement opponent, the tension in his camp was palpable. His coaches pushed him harder than ever, trying to keep him sharp, but the uncertainty surrounding Adesanya's status seemed to hang in the air, a thick cloud of doubt. Chimaev couldn't afford to be distracted, not now, not when he was so close. But the doubt had crept in, and even though he remained outwardly confident, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping from his grasp. Then, in a sudden twist of fate, the UFC made its decision. The official word came down that Israel Adesanya's injury was indeed serious, and the fight was officially postponed. The timeline for Adesanya's recovery was unclear, and the UFC announced that they would be looking for a replacement opponent for Chimaev. For Chimaev, this was both a blessing and a curse. The opportunity to fight for the title was still within reach, but the uncertainty of the situation was even more unsettling. Who would he face? Would it be another top contender? Would it be Vettori, the fighter he had just beaten? The decision to cancel the title fight wasn't the closure he had hoped for, but it was a reality he had to accept. As news of the postponement spread, the UFC was forced to shift its focus to the next possible contender for Chimaev. Fans who'd been eagerly anticipating the showdown between Chimaev and Adesanya found themselves grappling with the reality of an unexpected twist. Now, the question wasn't whether Chimaev could dethrone the champion, it was whether he could prove himself worthy of a new opponent and maintain the momentum that had made him a rising star. For Chimaev, the road to the title had just become even more uncertain, and the stakes had only gotten higher. In the midst of all this chaos, Vettori made his move. As the UFC considered its options for Chimaev's next fight, Vettori inserted himself back into the conversation. He knew that Chimaev, still in the hunt for the title, would likely need a worthy opponent in the interim. Why not face him again? Vettori's experience, his grit, and his hunger to get back to the top made him a dangerous challenger, and he was ready to prove that he still belonged. For him, a rematch with Chimaev was the perfect opportunity to silence the critics and reassert himself as a title contender. But Chimaev, already battling his own doubts, now had to consider the possibility of facing Vettori once more. The fight between them had been too close for comfort, and while he had come out on top, he couldn't ignore the feeling that Vettori had shown him a level of toughness that might be more than just a test. This wasn't just about claiming the title anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could handle whatever came his way. The stakes had never been higher for both men. As the UFC scrambled to put the pieces together, no one could predict what would happen next. Chimaev's quest for greatness had hit a crossroads. Adesanya's injury had shifted the landscape of the middleweight division, and now the true test was whether Chimaev could stay on course and take the title regardless of the challenges that lay ahead. The tension was building to a boiling point, and the fight for the throne was far from over. The tension surrounding Khamzat Chimaev's rise to the top of the UFC had reached a fever pitch. The uncertainty over whether he would face Adesanya or another contender had kept everyone on edge. With Adesanya's injury postponing the title fight, Chimaev's camp had been forced to stay sharp, constantly on alert for any news of a new opponent. As the weeks dragged on, rumors swirled and speculations ran wild, but Chimaev knew he couldn't wait forever. The UFC had made its decision. Chimaev would face Marvin Vettori again, but this time for the interim middleweight title. The stage was set for what would undoubtedly be a massive clash. Chimaev and Vettori, two fighters who had already gone to war before, now fighting for more than just pride. The stakes were higher than ever. For Chimaev, this was a chance to prove that his previous win over Vettori was no fluke. For Vettori, it was a chance to avenge his loss and reclaim his spot at the top of the division. The anticipation was palpable, and fans could feel the electricity in the air as UFC 312 approached. As the fight week arrived, the energy surrounding both fighters was unmatched. Chimaev had been dealing with the frustration of the uncertainty, but now he had a clear goal in front of him. His confidence had only grown since the fight with Adesanya was postponed. He had been through the mental and physical battles of preparing for a title shot, and now he was ready to face the toughest test of his career. There was no room for distraction, no time for doubt. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. But for Vettori, the pressure was just as intense. His previous loss to Chimaev had haunted him, and now he had the chance to rewrite the narrative. The months following that defeat had been filled with hard work and self-reflection. Vettori had spent every moment preparing for this exact fight. He knew Chimaev's strengths, and he understood his weaknesses. He had a plan, and he was more determined than ever to show the world that he could take down the unstoppable force that was Chimaev. As the fight began, it was clear that both men had prepared for war. The pace was furious from the start, with Chimaev pressing forward, using his relentless pressure and explosive strikes to keep Vettori on the back foot. Vettori, however, showed a different side of himself this time. He wasn't the same fighter Chimaev had faced before. He was sharper, more focused, and determined to keep the fight at a pace he could control. The exchanges were brutal, with both men landing heavy blows, but neither willing to give an inch. Chimaev's wrestling was as dominant as ever, and he seemed to be one step ahead in every grappling exchange. But Vettori's resilience was on full display. He took everything Chimaev threw at him and kept moving forward. Each round felt like a war, and both fighters dug deeper into their arsenals, trying to outwit and outlast the other. The tension in the arena grew with every passing minute, and the crowd could feel the intensity building to a crescendo. It was in the third round that things began to change. Chimaev, despite his relentless pressure, began to slow just a bit. His earlier explosive bursts seemed to be taking their toll, and Vettori seized the opportunity. With a perfectly timed counter, he rocked Chimaev with a massive right hand, sending him stumbling backward. Crowd erupted as Vettori pressed forward, sensing that the tide had turned. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Chimaev's legs wobbled, but he refused to go down. He fought through the days, his eyes locked onto Vettori, determined not to let this fight slip away. The tension in the arena was now palpable. Both fighters had pushed each other to the limit, but neither was willing to back down. The final round was a battle of wills. Chimaev, who had shown so much confidence leading up to the fight, now found himself in a dogfight. Vettori, sensing blood, continued to press the attack, but Chimaev, despite his exhaustion, fought with everything he had left. His corner screamed at him to dig deep, to push through the pain. This wasn't just about winning, it was about proving that he could overcome every obstacle in his way. The final horn sounded, and the fighters collapsed to the canvas. It had been a grueling, intense war, and no one knew who had come out on top. The judges took their time, and the suspense in the arena was unbearable. The UFC's biggest stars, analysts, and fans all held their breath, waiting for the decision that would determine who would be crowned the interim middleweight champion. Then, the announcement came. The judges had scored the fight in favor of Khamzat Chimaev. The arena erupted in a mix of cheers and boos, but for Chimaev, it was a moment of validation. He had survived the hardest test of his career and had emerged victorious once again. But as he stood in the center of the octagon, his hand raised in victory, something unexpected happened. Vettori, despite his loss, approached Chimaev and extended his hand. It was a moment of respect, something that few would have expected after such a brutal war. Chimaev, surprised, took his hand, nodding in acknowledgement of the heart Vettori had shown in the cage. It was a brief moment of mutual respect, a rare display of sportsmanship after such a fierce battle. But the final twist was yet to come. As Chimaev celebrated his victory and began to walk toward his corner, the arena lights suddenly dimmed. The crowd murmured in confusion, and the UFC's big screens flashed with an unexpected video. It wasn't a highlight reel of Chimaev's victory, it was a message. A new video from Israel Adesanya appeared on the screen, his face stern and focused. "The fight isn't over, Khamzat," his voice calm but filled with intensity. "I'm coming for you." The crowd went silent. For a moment, no one moved. The shock of the moment hit everyone all at once. Adesanya, despite his injury and the setbacks, was ready to return to the octagon. His message was clear. The title fight was not cancelled, and it was still very much on. But now, it wasn't just a matter of Chimaev proving himself. It was about whether he could handle the pressure of facing the champion, who had spent months preparing for this very moment. Chimaev stood frozen, a look of disbelief washing over him as he stared at the screen. His victory over Vettori was sweet, but the real challenge was still to come. The fight for the title was back on, and the stakes had never been higher. The true test was yet to come. The UFC was about to witness the most intense build-up to a championship fight it had ever seen. Khamzat Chimaev had earned his shot, but Israel Adesanya was ready for war. The fight for the middleweight crown was far from over, and the world would be watching closely. The anticipation for the showdown between Chimaev and Adesanya had just reached another level. The announcement from Israel Adesanya sent shockwaves through the MMA world. The crowd in the arena, still buzzing from Chimaev's hard-fought victory over Vettori, was now silenced by the looming promise of a showdown between the two most dominant fighters in the division. Chimaev, despite being celebrated for his resilience and strength in overcoming Vettori, knew that his true test had yet to come. Adesanya, after months of silence and uncertainty, was now stepping back into the spotlight, prepared to reclaim his spot atop the middleweight division. In the weeks that followed, the UFC put together a thrilling promotional campaign. The build-up to the fight was unlike anything seen before. Both fighters, now with a personal and professional stake in the outcome, engaged in a war of words through social media, interviews, and press conferences. Chimaev, who had once been largely an unknown entity, now found himself in the crosshairs of one of the most successful middleweight champions in history. Adesanya, known for his confidence and sometimes brash demeanor, threw everything he had at Chimaev, but the young contender remained unfazed, his eyes locked on the ultimate prize. The tension between the two was palpable. Chimaev's desire to prove himself against the best was only amplified by Adesanya's taunts. Adesanya, for his part, was eager to show the world that he was still the top dog, that the middleweight division was still his domain. Despite Chimaev's meteoric rise, Adesanya was determined to remind everyone why he had held the title for so long. It became clear to everyone watching that this was no ordinary championship. It was personal. This wasn't just about winning the belt. This was about legacy, respect, and proving who the real king of the middleweight division was. As Fight Week arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Fans from all over the world flocked to Las Vegas, eager to witness the long-anticipated clash between the two fighters. The UFC was buzzing with excitement, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The octagon was set, and the world's eyes were on Chimaev and Adesanya. The fight, which had been delayed due to Adesanya's injury, was now the main event of UFC 313. The night of the fight arrived, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Chimaev walked out to the octagon first, his usual swagger and confidence now replaced with an intensity that was unmistakable. His eyes were focused, his body language telling the story of a man who had trained tirelessly for this moment. The crowd roared as he entered the cage, but Chimaev was in his own world. The journey had been long, filled with highs and lows. But now, he was finally here, ready to prove to everyone and to himself that he belonged at the top. Moments later, Israel Adesanya made his entrance. The champion was met with a wave of cheers, his fans eager to see their favorite fighter back in action. Adesanya's confidence radiated from him as he strode into the octagon, wearing a look of determination that suggested he had been waiting for this fight just as long as Chimaev had. He was back, and he was hungry to reclaim what was rightfully his. The bell rang, and the fight was on. From the very first exchange, it was clear that both men had prepared for war. Adesanya's striking was sharp, his movement fluid as he danced around the cage, looking for openings. Chimaev, on the other hand, came out aggressively, his relentless pressure forcing Adesanya to work harder than he had in years. Every time Adesanya tried to establish his rhythm, Chimaev was there, pressuring him with heavy strikes and clinches, testing his endurance. The first round was a back-and-forth affair, with Chimaev's aggression meeting Adesanya's finesse. Chimaev was relentless, closing the distance and trying to put Adesanya against the cage, but the champion's footwork and timing were on full display. Adesanya found success with his counters, landing clean shots to Chimaev's head and body. But Chimaev's chin held up, and he kept coming forward, refusing to be intimidated. By the second round, it was clear that Chimaev's game plan was to wear Adesanya down. The pressure was building, and Adesanya was starting to show signs of fatigue. His movements were a little slower, his responses less sharp. Chimaev's strategy was simple: make the champion work harder than he had ever worked before. Push him into uncomfortable positions, make him feel the weight of Chimaev's power, and force him to expend energy defending the relentless attacks. Halfway through the second round, Chimaev's pressure paid off. He managed to close the distance, and, after a few exchanges, caught Adesanya with a huge right hand that sent the champion stumbling back. Adesanya quickly regained his balance, but the damage was done. Chimaev smelled blood and went in for the kill. He swarmed Adesanya, landing a barrage of punches, pushing him to the cage and maintaining control of the center of the octagon. The crowd was on its feet, roaring as Chimaev began to dominate the champion. Adesanya, though hurt, managed to defend himself well, rolling with the punches and using his experience to stay out of danger. But it was clear that Chimaev's style, his ability to press the action and impose his will, was slowly wearing Adesanya down. The third round started with both fighters looking to assert dominance. Adesanya, aware that he needed to regain control, began using his jab more effectively to keep Chimaev at bay. But Chimaev, relentless as ever, closed the distance and pushed the pace. He was unyielding, throwing combinations and clinching with Adesanya whenever the champion tried to reset. Adesanya, despite his brilliance, was having trouble finding his rhythm. Chimaev's relentless pressure was stifling his ability to land clean strikes. Then, in the middle of the third round, Chimaev saw his opening. Adesanya threw a leg kick, and Chimaev caught it. Without hesitation, he drove the champion to the mat with a perfectly executed takedown. Crowd erupted as Chimaev moved into dominant position. Adesanya, known for his ability to defend takedowns and scramble to his feet, was now on the defensive. Chimaev was relentless, controlling Adesanya on the ground, landing heavy ground and pound punches that left the champion scrambling. For the first time in the fight, Adesanya was in serious trouble. His movements slowed, and the fatigue from Chimaev's constant pressure began to show. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, but also with tension. Would Chimaev be able to finish the champion, or would Adesanya's championship heart find a way to fight through the adversity? As the final round approached, both fighters were exhausted, battered, and bruised. The energy in the arena was palpable. The crowd knew that this was the final stretch, one more round to determine who would emerge victorious. Adesanya, with his back against the wall, had no choice but to dig deep. He found a second wind, landing a few sharp counters that rocked Chimaev. The champion was showing his resilience, refusing to go down without a fight. But Chimaev, sensing the end was near, didn't back down. He pushed forward with everything he had left, landing clean punches to Adesanya's head and body. The champion, despite his best efforts, couldn't keep up with the relentless pace of Chimaev. As the final bell rang, the fighters were both exhausted, but Chimaev's hand was raised in victory. The decision came down to the judges, and after a tense moment, they declared Khamzat Chimaev the winner by unanimous decision. The crowd erupted in cheers as Chimaev, exhausted and battered, stood tall in the center of the octagon. He had done it. He had defeated the middleweight champion, Israel Adesanya, and claimed the UFC middleweight championship. The world had witnessed his rise from a promising contender to a true champion. But as Chimaev held the belt aloft, the unexpected happened once again. As he celebrated, the lights dimmed and a new video message appeared on the screen. It wasn't from Adesanya this time. It was from another challenger. A familiar face, one that Chimaev knew well. It was Marvin Vettori. "I told you I'd be back," Vettori said with a grin. "And I'm coming for that title next." Chimaev's victory was sweet, but the road ahead was far from over. His reign as champion was just beginning, and the division was filled with hungry challengers. Vettori, now back in the picture, was ready to prove that he still belonged at the top. The UFC middleweight division had never been so exciting, and Chimaev's journey, though triumphant, was far from finished. The audience, while thrilled with the resolution of Chimaev's rise to the top, was left with one final cliffhanger. Who would be the next to challenge the new champion? Would Chimaev's reign be as dominant as his rise? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: Khamzat Chimaev had solidified himself as one of the most dangerous and exciting fighters in UFC history. His journey had been filled with obstacles, twists, and turns, but in the end, he had emerged victorious. The king of the middleweight division had arrived, and the MMA world would never be the same.